It was my 73rd birthday. I remember the smell of rosemary chicken in the oven, and the way the candles flickered gently on the sideboard, trying to make the house look warmer than it felt. I had set the table the night before, polishing the old silverware, even though my wrists ached. I baked 2 pies, because Sarah liked apple and Jeremy preferred cherry. I still remembered those things, their favorites, their allergies, their small, strange habits, even if they'd stopped remembering mine. They came late, of course, bustling in with loud voices and laughter, barely pausing to meet my eye. My granddaughter Mia was wearing headphones when she walked in and didn't take them off until her mother hissed at her to be polite. No one brought a card. No one brought flowers. There were no wrapped gifts, no candles lit for me. Just noise, loud chewing, quick glances at phones, forks clinking while I tried to hold on to the last thread of tradition. At first I told myself not to take it personally. They're busy, I whispered inside, at least they came. But that whisper turned bitter by the time dessert came. They didn't offer to help me serve it. They didn't help me clean the table. My daughter laughed when I asked if someone could carry the heavy casserole dish to the sink, said Mom. You're still strong, you've got this, and turned away to scroll. I stood there, hands full heart, heavy, looking around my own kitchen and realizing I'd somehow become the help. The moment that really stayed with me came later, after they'd all gone home. The dishes were still in the sink. I sat down at the edge of my bed, my knees aching, and unwrapped the only gift I got, one I had bought for myself weeks earlier. A new sweater, soft and pale blue. I folded it over my lap and stared at the floor, wondering how I had raised people who could show up for a birthday dinner and leave without saying thank you. It wasn't about gifts. It was never about gifts. It was the emptiness, the vacuum of care, the silence after the door shut, the crumbs left on the counter, the way they never once asked how I was, how I'd been feeling, how I was sleeping. I could have dropped to the floor, and I don't think they would have noticed. They were too busy talking about their own lives, planning trips, arguing about streaming passwords. That night I didn't cry. Not yet. That came later. But I did lie awake for hours listening to the creaks in the house and the hum of the refrigerator. In that stillness, something shifted. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of awareness, like the light finally being turned on in a dusty room I hadn't looked at in years. I began to question things I'd once defended. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe I'm just sensitive. Maybe this is normal. But as the hours crawled by, those excuses began to sound like lies. I thought about the times I had sent them money when they were short on rent, the times I had babysat at the last minute, the times I had put their needs above my own comfort. Because I believed that's what mothers do. That's what good mothers do. But that night I felt like the word mother had been emptied out, hollowed into something they only used when it was convenient. When the sun finally rose pale and watery through the curtains, I got out of bed, stepped over the unpacked gift bag, and made myself tea. I didn't touch the leftover pie. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window and realized I looked tired, not just old, but tired in the soul. That birthday wasn't just a celebration that never came. It was a wake-up call, a soft, sad realization that I had been clapping for them all these years, and they had stopped clapping for me a long time ago. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. I did what I always did, cleaned up. I wiped the counters, did the dishes, packed the leftovers, but inside me something small and significant had cracked open, a seed planted. Not revenge, not cruelty, but truth. And truth, I would learn, doesn't bloom overnight. It grows slowly in quiet moments, in the way your hand hesitates over your checkbook, in the way you pause before replying to a message, in the way you start remembering what you gave and what was never given back. It started small, like most things do. A few dollars here and there, a grocery bill that needed covering a car repair they didn't expect. I told myself it was temporary, that they were just getting their feet under them. I remember writing the first check to Jeremy. When he lost his job, he didn't even have to ask. He just mentioned it on the phone, and I interrupted him saying, "I'll help." Don't worry, I meant it. I always meant it. But over time, those little moments grew. It stopped being occasional and became routine. The phone would ring, and I'd already feel the knot tighten in my stomach. They didn't even pretend anymore. They'd just say, "Hey, Mom, quick favor," and my heart would sink before I even heard the number. It wasn't just Jeremy. Sarah needed help with daycare. Then she needed help with rent. Then with tuition. Somehow my small pension became the safety net for everyone but me. I didn't track it at first. I didn't want to. But one night, sitting in bed with a flashlight, because the power had gone out, my own bill unpaid, I looked through my checkbook. Page after page, filled with their names, their emergencies, their needs, my sacrifices. I couldn't remember the last time any of them had asked if I was okay. I couldn't remember the last time they had helped me. It was the same month Jeremy bought a new SUV. I saw the photo on social media, all smiles, glossy, paint a bow on the hood like it was Christmas. He hadn't mentioned it in our last call, just said things were tight. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I looked over at the space heater I'd pulled out, because the furnace had been acting up again, and I felt this strange, hollow ache. Not anger exactly, not yet just disappointment, like I had been traded in for leather seats. Sarah posted pictures of her beach trip a week later. She was drinking something bright and frozen. Mia was making sandcastles in a new swimsuit. That same week, I'd skipped my dentist appointment because I couldn't afford the copay. I hadn't told them. I didn't want to sound ungrateful or worse, like a burden. I just sat in my living room, the fan spinning too slowly, watching dust float through the sunlight, and thought this isn't how it was supposed to go. I had always believed that helping my children would come back around one day, that once they were stable, they'd remember, that there would be thank yous, small kindnesses, maybe a surprise lunch, a visit just because. But it never came. Instead, every time I pulled out my wallet, it felt like slipping away, a little more of myself. And for what? So they could live lives that didn't include me. One day, the bank called about an overdraft. I had forgotten that Sarah's auto transfer was scheduled the same week as my property tax. I apologized, flustered, and hung up with shaking hands. I sat on the floor of my pantry surrounded by cans I'd been stretching for weeks and cried. Not because I was broke, not just that, but because I had done this to myself. I had confused generosity with self-erasure. I had mistaken sacrifice for love returned. That evening I looked through the stack of envelopes I'd been ignoring. Bills, all mine, all unpaid. I thought about how many times I'd told them I'm okay, how often I had smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart." But the truth was I wasn't okay. I hadn't been for a long time. I was keeping their lives afloat while mine slowly sank. And worst of all, I don't think they even noticed. That realization, the raw, unbearable quiet of it, sat heavier than any bill. They were living fully freely, while I was rationing soup and turning off lights early to save on electricity. They had new shoes. I had holes in mine. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about the fact that I was only seen when they needed something, that their love seemed to run on transactions. And when I finally needed just a little, just someone to ask Mom, "Do you need anything?" there was nothing, just silence. The next day I made a decision. I called the bank and canceled the auto transfers. My hand trembled as I did it. I imagined the conversations that would follow, the accusations, the guilt trips. But I knew even then that it had to start somewhere. a line drawn however faint in the sand. They wouldn't feel it at first. The ripple wouldn't reach them for weeks. But for me, that one act was like standing up after years of kneeling. My knees were stiff, my balance wobbled, but I stood anyway. And for the first time in a long time, I held something back for myself. She used to call me Nana Bird. I don't even remember where the nickname came from. Maybe it was the way I'd hum as I brushed her hair, or how I'd point out cardinals on our morning walks. When she was small, Mia would slip her tiny hand into mine and ask me questions about the world, about life, about love. Her eyes used to sparkle with curiosity, and her laugh could melt me like butter on warm bread. But children grow. That's natural. What I wasn't prepared for was how fast they grow away from you when the ones raising them don't teach them to look back. The last time she came over, she walked through the front door still tapping on her phone. Her mother shouted something about taking her shoes off, but Mia didn't look up. She sat on the couch, knees tucked under her screen glowing against her face. I greeted her with a smile, hoping she'd remember who I was beyond holiday dinners. "Hi, sweet girl," I said, "how's school?" She didn't even lift her eyes. Fine. One word, flat, dismissive. Like the years I'd spent caring for her were a book she no longer needed to read. I tried again, asked about her favorite teacher. Her violin lessons. She shrugged, said I don't really do that anymore. Then silence, tapping, the flicker of scrolling glass. Her mother didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She was busy in the kitchen asking if I had any almond milk, fussing about her low-carb diet, talking over me while I tried to explain where the mugs were now. I brought Mia a glass of lemonade the same way I used to when she was 5. She took it without a glance. No thank you, no smile, just sipped and went back to watching something on her phone. It wasn't just the screen, it was her eyes. They looked straight through me, like I wasn't a person anymore, just an old piece of furniture in a familiar room. I wanted to scream, to shake someone, to say, "Do you not see me? Do you not see what you're teaching her?" But I didn't. I just sat there with my hands folded, the lemonade sweating in my own cup. Later, when they left, I walked back into the living room and found a candy wrapper on the floor and a charger left plugged into my wall. No goodbye hug. No, see you soon. Just the door clicking shut and the low hum of a car pulling away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the charger. It was pink. It had little stickers on it. I remembered buying those same stickers for her once, back when she still made scrapbooks with me at the kitchen table. I picked it up, held it like it meant something, then quietly put it in a drawer. That night I sat on my porch and watched the moon rise. The air smelled like honeysuckle, but even the sweetness didn't touch me. I kept thinking, she doesn't know me anymore. And worse, she doesn't want to. I tried to tell myself she was just a teenager, that this was a phase. But the truth is, children don't become indifferent in a vacuum. They learn what's important by watching the adults around them. And the adults in her life had long since decided that I was background noise. It hurt in a way I didn't have words for, not sharp pain, something duller, heavier, like a blanket soaked in water draped over my chest. I kept replaying old memories, how she'd once fallen asleep on my lap, how I'd taught her how to braid her hair, how I'd stayed up sewing her Halloween costume when she was sick. And now I was just a shadow in her peripheral vision. The betrayal wasn't hers, not entirely, but it still landed like a blow. I used to believe that love once poured into someone always left a trace. But what they don't tell you is that traces can fade if no one tends to them. And mine, the memories, the affection, the roots I planted, were being swept away like sand at the edge of the tide. So I stopped trying so hard. The next time they visited, I didn't scramble to make fresh cookies. I didn't rush to clean the porch or put on lipstick. I simply sat in my chair knitting and nodded when they came in. Mia walked past me without a word. I didn't chase her with questions. And when they left that time, I didn't go to the window to watch the car pull away. I just stayed in my chair, feeling the quiet settle around me like an old friend. Something inside me had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. It had been raining that morning, soft at first, then relentless. The kind of steady drumming rain that makes you feel like the sky has made up its mind to forget the sun altogether. I woke up to the sound of water where it shouldn't be, a slow rhythmic drip in the hallway. I followed the sound barefoot, careful not to slip, and found a small brown stain blooming on the ceiling right above the linen cabinet. A leak. A quiet one, but growing. I stood there, arms folded tight against my chest, watching the ceiling sag ever so slightly, and thought, not today. Please, not today. My hip had been giving me trouble for weeks, an old injury that flared when the weather changed. I kept brushing it off, telling myself it would pass, but bending, lifting, reaching all of it had become a quiet war with my body. I shuffled into the kitchen, sat down slowly, and stared at the phone on the counter. For a long time, I just looked at it. Then finally, I picked it up and dialed Sarah. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I hate to ask, but I've got a leak in the hallway ceiling, and I think it's getting worse. Would you mind coming by and having a look, or maybe Jeremy could?" There was a pause. Then Mom, "Can't you just call a plumber?" "I can," I said. I just thought maybe. "Well, you know someone, and I'm not sure how much it'll cost." Another pause. A breath. "I'm really swamped this week. Work's insane. Can you just handle it? Maybe check Yelp or something." She didn't even ask how bad it was. Didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't offer to come by later or to send someone. Just that clipped tone, not cruel, just detached, like I was a distant errand on a long list she didn't have time to finish. I said, "Okay," and hung up before my voice cracked. Then I just sat there. The silence in the kitchen felt thicker than the rain outside. I stared at the table, at the bowl of pears I had arranged the day before, still life going soft. Later I tried Jeremy. His voicemail picked up. I didn't leave a message. It was such a small thing, a leak. Nothing dramatic. But what I really needed wasn't a handyman. It was someone to show up, someone to see me struggling and step in, not because I begged, but because they wanted to. I ended up calling a neighbor's son. He was kind, quick, and even refused payment after patching the roof temporarily. My mom would want someone to help her too, he said with a shrug. And that almost broke me. Because this stranger, this boy I barely knew, showed me more care in 20 minutes than my children had in 20 years. When he left, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. I didn't finish staring out at the gray yard, the puddles collecting around the hydrangeas, and I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What am I even holding on to? I told myself for years that family was everything, that blood matters, that they loved me just in their own way. But love, I was beginning to understand, isn't proven by words or DNA. It's proven by action, by effort. And when I had needed even the smallest gesture of effort, they weren't there. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because I couldn't bear the echo of my own disappointment. I kept thinking about Sarah's voice, that sharp sigh, before she brushed me off. And the worst part, I hadn't been surprised. Hurt, yes, but not surprised. Somewhere deep inside, I had expected it. That was the most painful realization of all. The next morning, I opened my notebook and wrote in it for the first time in weeks, "Stop asking them for help. They've already shown you the answer." It wasn't a dramatic vow, just a note to myself, a line drawn in fading ink. but it stayed with me. From that day forward, every time I faced something difficult, whether it was a grocery run in the rain or a letter I couldn't read clearly, I reminded myself, don't ask, they won't come. And in that emptiness, I began to find something surprising clarity. I wasn't asking anymore because I didn't deserve help. I wasn't asking because the people I had poured everything into had never learned how to pour anything back. It was late in the afternoon when I overheard them. The house had that golden hush it always gets when the sun starts sinking low and everything slows down. Shadows, lengthening floors, warm under bare feet. I was in the hallway folding towels still warm from the dryer when I heard my children talking in the living room. They didn't know I was nearby. Sarah's voice floated through first light and joking, I'm calling dibs on the pearl ring when Mom goes. You know the one from Grandma Rose. There was a pause, then laughter, Jeremy's voice chiming in, amused. Please, that thing's barely worth anything. I want the house, or at least her savings. She's been living like a nun for decades. She has to be sitting on something. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Sarah giggled. Well, I better stay on her good side then. You know how she gets when someone forgets to call her back. More laughter. A kind of laughter that doesn't belong to people who love you. A laughter that strips you down, reduces you to an inventory. A ledger of assets waiting to be divided. The towels slipped from my hands onto the floor. I didn't bother to pick them up. I just stood there cold and quiet, feeling a sting sharper than anything I'd felt in years. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. Careless, casual, like they were talking about a garage sale, not a person, not me. I walked away before they saw me. Slowly. My legs felt heavy like I was walking underwater. I went into my bedroom, closed the door softly, and sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at my jewelry box. The one with the faded pink lining, the one I had owned since I was 17. Inside was the pearl ring they had mocked passed down through 4 generations of women, each of whom had worn it on her wedding day. I lifted the lid and looked at it. It didn't sparkle much anymore. The band was scratched. But I remembered my mother's trembling hands as she gave it to me. I remembered the quiet pride I felt wearing it, the sense of history wrapped around my finger. To them, it was barely worth anything. I put the ring back gently and closed the box. My hand lingered on the lid for a moment longer. Then I got up and locked it in the small safe I kept in the closet. Not because I thought they'd steal it, not yet, but because I didn't want them to touch it. That evening we sat down for dinner like nothing had happened. They didn't know I had heard. They laughed and chatted completely unaware that every word felt like sandpaper against my skin. I watched them as they passed the breadbasket. I watched their hands, the same hands I'd once held to cross the street, to comfort, after nightmares, to steady their spoons when they were sick. And I thought, you don't see me anymore. You see a vault, a prize. The betrayal that day wasn't loud. It was quiet, offhand. That made it worse. If they'd screamed, or accused, or fought, I could have understood. But that casual, amused conversation told me everything I needed to know. I was not a person to them. I was a collection of things. That night I stayed up reorganizing. Not just the jewelry box, but the filing cabinet, the bank statements, the documents. I realized I didn't want them to inherit things they didn't respect. I didn't want my life's quiet work, my thrift, my sacrifices to become a spoils pile. I began researching charitable trusts. I started writing names in a notebook. Old friends, kind nurses, the local library that had brought me so much comfort. For the first time, I began thinking not about who deserved what, but who would honor it. I thought about giving the pearl ring to Mia one day if she ever found her way back to kindness. But even that was a maybe. From then on, I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to see before. How Sarah lingered when I mentioned life insurance. How Jeremy joked about early retirement if I ever sold the house. How their eyes lit up not when I shared memories, but when I mentioned anything with a $sign attached. I kept smiling. I kept serving dinner. But inside I was retreating, gathering the pieces of myself they had scattered, starting to fold up the map that had once led them to me. Because now I knew they weren't following it anymore. They were looking for shortcuts, for treasure, not for love. And so I began to make plans. It didn't happen all at once. Like most disappearances, it was gradual, a slow fading, a quiet erosion of space and self. I used to think of my home as sacred, a place where my touch was everywhere, the arrangement of cushions, the smell of lavender from the linen closet, the small porcelain birds on the windowsill. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being mine. They started coming over without calling. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd be halfway through my tea and my robe hair uncombed, when the door would swing open, and Sarah's voice would fill the house like a thunderclap. "Mom, you home." No knock, no pause, just entry, like I was a guest in my own life waiting for their arrival. Jeremy started helping himself to the fridge. He'd come in and open it before even saying hello, rummaging for snacks or cold drinks, like he lived there. I remember once watching him pour the last of my orange juice into a tumbler, take a sip, and toss the empty carton on the counter without a glance. I had been saving that juice. It was silly, just a few sips, but it felt like something precious had been stolen. Then they started moving things. "This should really go here," Sarah said, once shifting my spice rack. Without asking. "You've got too many of these old knickknacks," Jeremy muttered another time, picking up one of my ceramic vases and examining it like a thrift store item. Even Mia joined in, propping her feet on my coffee table, leaving wrappers on the floor. No one noticed when I quietly picked them up after they left. The living room began to change. My chair, the one with the quilt I'd sewn years ago, was suddenly piled with their coats. The hallway closet, once neat and filled with my labeled boxes, was jammed with their extra shoes and shopping bags. Bit by bit, they were taking over, claiming without claiming. They never said it aloud, but I could feel it. They saw my house as temporary, as something that would soon belong to them. And so they treated it like an early inheritance, a place to occupy, not to respect. One Sunday afternoon, I came back from the market to find Sarah reorganizing my pantry. "You buy the weirdest brands," she said with a laugh, holding up a tin of sardines. "Let's make this more efficient." I just stood there in the doorway, bags in my hands, wind still clinging to my coat. She didn't stop, didn't ask, just kept sorting, tossing my preferences aside like expired labels. That night I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time someone asked if I liked something, if I was comfortable. I used to host with joy. Now I hosted by default. I wasn't a matriarch anymore. I was a fixture, like the old floor lamp in the corner no one turns on. I began to feel like a ghost, present but passed over, heard but not listened to. Even the way they spoke to me changed. Their voices grew sharper, more distracted. They interrupted. They rolled their eyes. If I asked about their lives, they answered with sighs and vague updates. If I offered stories from my past, they nodded without hearing. I had become the wallpaper to their conversations, a backdrop for their louder, brighter, busier lives. One afternoon, I found myself apologizing for asking them to take off their muddy shoes in the hallway. "Sorry," I mumbled. "I just cleaned the floor." Jeremy didn't even look down. "Relax, Mom," he said. "It's just a floor." But it wasn't just a floor. It was mine. I had scrubbed that floor with aching knees and old rags. It was the floor where I had danced barefoot with their father, where Mia had taken her first wobbly steps, where I had paced back and forth during nights I couldn't sleep. I started locking my bedroom door, not because I thought they'd take anything, but because I needed one space, one room that was still wholly mine, my sanctuary. I kept it clean and quiet, lit a candle in the evenings, played soft music from the old radio. It became the only place in the house where I felt like I still existed. They never asked why the door was locked, or if I was okay. They just started using the rest of the house like it belonged to them, and maybe in their minds it already did. That thought sat with me for weeks, cold, heavy, familiar. Until one morning, I looked at the key on my ring, the one to the front door, and realized something I hadn't admitted before I wasn't afraid of losing the house. I was afraid they already had. Not in title, not legally, but in spirit. They had occupied every corner with their entitlement, their noise, their assumptions. And I slowly and quietly had faded out of the home I once built with my own hands. That was the day I began thinking about leaving, not just in theory, but truly practically. What if I left them with this house? What if I took myself the real treasure and disappeared into somewhere quiet, somewhere mine? What if I stopped fighting to exist inside walls where I was no longer seen? The thought scared me, but it also set something free. It was Christmas morning and the house smelled like cinnamon oranges and the faint trace of pine from the artificial tree I had dusted off and assembled alone 2 weeks before. I had stayed up late the night before wrapping presents on the kitchen table, each label written in my careful script to Mia, to Sarah, to Jeremy, and their spouses too. I had bought gifts for all of them, even the ones who never called, even the ones who had forgotten my birthday again this year. The fireplace crackled with a pre-recorded log from a streaming app. The real fireplace hadn't been used in years, and I didn't want to risk the mess. I had arranged the cookies on the same red tray I always used, filled the candy bowl with ribbon mints, and laid out matching mugs for cocoa. It looked perfect. Picture perfect. And in the quiet before they arrived, I allowed myself to imagine, just for a second, that maybe this year would be different. They arrived late. Of course they did. Sarah came in first, juggling bags and boxes that weren't wrapped. "We didn't get a chance," she said, with a breathy smile. "It's been crazy." Jeremy followed, already complaining about the traffic. Mia trailed behind, earbuds and thumbs tapping at her phone screen, eyes never meeting mine. There were no gifts in their hands, not for me, but I smiled anyway. I told myself at least they came. I served breakfast. I poured coffee. I offered everyone warm slippers from the basket near the door the way I had every Christmas since they were little. No one said thank you. They just drifted into the living room where the presents I had carefully wrapped sat waiting beneath the tree. I had spent more than I should have. I'd used my credit card for a few of the gifts, especially the noise-canceling headphones. Mia had wanted the ones she had pointed out once in passing months ago, not thinking I'd remember. But I had. Of course I had. That's what I did. They opened their gifts quickly, wrapping paper everywhere. No one waited or watched. No one looked at me. No one asked how long it had taken, how I'd remembered their sizes, their preferences. Mia opened her headphones and said, "Oh, cool," then went back to her phone. Jeremy looked up once to say, "Thanks, Mom," before returning to a conversation about his fantasy football league. Sarah laughed at a meme on her screen. And I stood there holding a small plate of gingerbread cookies, feeling like a waitress at a party I wasn't invited to. Later, as I cleared the paper and discarded bows, I realized none of them had noticed I hadn't opened anything. Not one gift with my name on it sat beneath the tree. No envelope, no card, no candle, no mug, nothing. I sat alone in the kitchen while they carried on in the next room, voices rising and falling in conversation that no longer included me. I stirred the cocoa I had made for myself. The whipped cream had melted. The cinnamon stick tilted in the mug, like it had given up trying to look festive. I thought about the years I had made magic out of nothing. The handmade decorations, the knitted stockings, the cookies with their initials. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up sewing costumes for school pageants, driving across town for forgotten instruments, holding their hair back while they vomited from the flu. And now I was invisible. A purse, a pantry, a free babysitter, a fading woman who bought too many presents and asked too few questions. The betrayal wasn't in what they didn't bring. It was in what they didn't see. Me. The effort, the love wrapped in those gifts, the stories behind each one, how I'd remembered, how I'd saved, how I had still hoped. But something shifted that day, subtle but permanent. I stopped asking myself, why aren't they better? And started wondering, why do I keep pretending they are? When they left, I stood at the door and waved. They drove away laughing, already making plans for New Year's. I walked back inside and sat on the couch. The room was littered with torn paper, empty boxes, and a half-eaten candy cane that had fallen behind the sofa cushion. And I knew without drama or tears that this was the last Christmas I would ever host. They didn't know it yet, but I did. That night I wrote in my notebook again, "Love isn't shown by what you give, it's shown by whether anyone ever gives back." Then I folded the page carefully, tucked it beneath the pearl ring in my drawer, and turned off the lights. For the first time in a long time, I didn't leave the tree lit overnight. I didn't need the glow. Something brighter had lit up inside me instead. It was a Tuesday morning in February. Gray sky, stiff wind, the kind that made my joints whisper warnings before I even stepped out of bed. I had a doctor's appointment that day. Nothing dire, just a follow-up about the scans they'd done on my hip, and a few questions about the fluttering in my chest I hadn't told anyone about yet. I had mentioned the appointment to Sarah the week before. She'd said, Yeah, I'll come get you. Just remind me the night before. So I did. I sent her a message. Just a soft nudge, not wanting to seem like I was pressing. She didn't reply. I waited anyway. The appointment was at 10. I got up early, showered, slowly picked out a sweater that didn't cling too tightly. I even wore the little gold necklace Sarah gave me 15 years ago, back when she still bought me things without being reminded. I made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and waited for her car to pull into the driveway. By 9:20, I started to worry. By 9:30, I tried calling. No answer. By 9:40, I knew. I ended up calling a taxi service. It cost more than I wanted to spend, but I told myself, just get there. Don't make it a thing. The driver was kind enough. A quiet older man who helped me into the seat and turned the heat up without asking. I thanked him too many times out of habit. At the clinic, they were running late. I sat in the waiting room with my coat folded over my lap, watching people come and go in pairs, husbands with wives, daughters with their mothers, neighbors, chatting quietly as they flipped through magazines. I sat alone, no one to talk to, no one to explain the medical jargon when the nurse finally called me back, no one to nod in reassurance when the doctor mentioned the word monitoring, no one to notice when my hands trembled as I zipped up my purse. I rode home in another taxi. The seatbelt caught at my shoulder and pinched my neck, but I didn't complain. When I walked through my front door, the silence hit me like a gust of cold air. I stood there in the entryway for a long time, holding my coat like a child who didn't know where to put it. Then I went into the kitchen and made a sandwich I didn't eat. At 3:47 p.m., Sarah finally texted back, "OMG, Mom, I totally forgot. Today was insane. I'm so sorry. Did you make it okay? I stared at the message. My fingers hovered over the screen. I could have said so much. I could have told her how scared I'd felt when the doctor mentioned my irregular heart rhythm. I could have told her about the way I kept looking at the clinic door, hoping she'd rush in, breathless, apologizing in person. I could have said, "It hurt. It really hurt." But I didn't. I just replied, "Yes. Got there fine. Hope your day is better now." And that was that. No call, no follow-up, no visit. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some guilt, maybe an offer to reschedule to take me to the next one. But nothing came. And that night, as I brushed my teeth, I realized something I hadn't let myself say out loud before. If I fell tomorrow, if I collapsed in this bathroom, how long would it take them to notice? Days, weeks? It wasn't just about the doctor. It was about the slow decay of care. The way I had become a second thought, a glitch in their calendars, a line item on their to-do list they never quite got to. I sat down on the edge of my bed, the room quiet around me, and felt something settle into my chest. Not sadness, but a kind of knowing, a permanent shift in the floorboards of my heart. If they couldn't show up for something as simple as a ride to the doctor, they weren't going to show up for the hard things, the real things, the end-of-life things. And I needed to stop pretending otherwise. I opened my drawer and pulled out a manila folder, the one I'd labeled Next Steps. Inside were all the things no one wants to think about: power of attorney, advance directives, contacts for my lawyer, and my funeral wishes. I added a note: remove Sarah and Jeremy from emergency contact list. It wasn't revenge, it was preparation. It was honesty. Because the people listed on that form should be the ones who will sit beside you in the waiting room, not the ones who forget you were there. When I turned off the light, the room felt different. Not warmer, not softer, but mine, fully mine. And I began to understand solitude isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's the door you close to keep the cold out for good. The first no came out as a whisper. I almost didn't recognize it as my own voice. It was a Tuesday evening, I remember, because the wind had picked up and was rattling the windows, and I had just finished my soup when the phone rang. It was Jeremy, sounding casual, breezy, even like he hadn't gone silent for 3 weeks. "Hey, Mom. Listen, I hate to ask, but I'm in a bit of a bind. I was wondering if you could spot me a few hundred just till Friday. I'll pay you back, swear." I stared at the phone in my hand, not because of the amount, not because I couldn't do it, but because I knew he wouldn't pay me back. He never did. I knew the bind wasn't sudden. It never was. I knew he had called because I was the easy option, the default rescue, not because he cared how I was doing. And so I said softly, "No, Jeremy, not this time." There was silence on the other end, a long one. What he said with a small laugh, as if I hadn't understood his request. I said, "No," I repeated, this time with less apology. "I can't help you with that anymore." The shift in his tone was instant. "Seriously, you've helped before. It's not a big deal. I'm just a little short this week." "I know," I said, "but I'm not short this week. I'm empty, and I don't think you've noticed." I don't remember what else was said. He hung up, angry, confused, probably feeling betrayed in the way people do when their favorite crutch suddenly moves out from under them. But after the call ended, I sat there in the quiet, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, and I waited for the guilt to come. It didn't. What came instead was a strange sense of stillness, like I had just dropped a heavy suitcase I'd been carrying for far too long. The second no came a week later when Sarah asked if I could watch Mia overnight so she could go out of town with her boyfriend. I told her I wasn't available. She didn't even pretend to be grateful. "You're always home," she snapped. "Why are you being like this?" "I'm not being anything," I said calmly. "I just have plans. For myself." Another silence. Another wave of indignation. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll figure something else out." And she did. That's what surprised me the most. They figured it out. I wasn't needed, not in the way they'd made me believe. I was convenient. I was comfortable. I was a safety net they could toss their weight into whenever they pleased. But once I began cutting the cords, the money, the favors, the automatic yeses, they wobbled for a second, then landed just fine. They weren't helpless. They were just used to taking. What shook me more than their reactions was how quiet my house felt afterward. There were fewer calls, fewer pop-ins, fewer texts, and at first that silence felt like punishment, like I had committed a crime I couldn't name. But slowly it began to feel like air, like freedom. I started sleeping better, eating slower, reading books without being interrupted. I rearranged my kitchen the way I liked it. I threw out expired food I had bought for them. I donated old toys, shoes, coats, things they had outgrown, but left behind like I was some storage facility for their childhood. And in all of that, I found pieces of myself, tucked in corners I had long abandoned. I remembered I liked sewing. I remembered I loved the scent of rosemary oil before bed. I started lighting candles at dinner time just for me, even if I was eating toast and jam. The more I said no to them, the more I began saying yes to myself. They noticed eventually. The tone of their calls shifted, more sugar in their voices, more sudden just checking in messages. But I could hear the edge underneath the confusion, the calculation. I had changed the rules without asking their permission, and that unsettled them. But I didn't owe them an explanation. Not anymore. The third no was the hardest. Mia called me herself. "Nana," she said sweetly, "Mom says you won't give her the money for the new violin. She said you used to care more." That one cut, not because of the words, but because they had sent her in to do the asking, using the child I once held through fevers and nightmares as a messenger for guilt. I paused, took a breath, then said gently, "Sweetheart, it's not about the violin. It's about what people remember and what they forget. And I think your mom has forgotten a lot." Mia was quiet. Then, "Okay." No more was said, but I could hear something in her silence, maybe a seed being planted. Maybe not. It wasn't up to me anymore. That night, I wrote again in my notebook. Every time I said yes when I meant no, I disappeared a little more. I think it's time I come back to life. I slept with the window cracked open that night. The cold didn't bother me, not anymore. Because for the first time in years, I was warm in my own skin. His office was nothing like I expected. No oak walls, no shelves of leather-bound books, just soft lighting, clean lines, and the faint scent of paper and peppermint. There was a quiet hum in the background, a printer maybe, or the soft static of lives being changed without much ceremony. I sat down in the chair across from his desk and placed the manila folder between us. My hands didn't shake. Not this time. He looked like the kind of man who appreciated silence, not the awkward kind, but the purposeful kind. The kind that gives you space to think before you say something that matters. He had kind eyes. I liked that about him. "I'd like to make some changes to my will," I said. He nodded. "Of course, take your time." And I did. I spoke slowly, clearly, as if each word were a piece of china being laid on a table. I told him what I had who had once been written into it, and who I was now ready to remove. I told him I wanted to redirect things, the house, the savings, the bonds, even the little parcels of land my father had left me in the countryside. He didn't interrupt, just took notes, his pen moving like water across the page. "I'd like to create a scholarship," I said, "for older women going back to school. Something in memory of my mother. She never got to finish her education." He looked up then and smiled, not out of surprise, but with something that felt like quiet approval. "And the house?" he asked. "I want it donated," I said, "to a local shelter, for women starting over." He nodded again. No pushback, no confusion, no questions about my children, just the facts drawn with care. "And your children?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath. Nothing, not anymore. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he folded his hands together and leaned back. "I've helped people with this kind of decision before," he said, "but I can tell you're not doing this in anger." "No," I said, "not anger, just clarity." I didn't explain the birthdays forgotten, the requests unanswered, the soft betrayals that had stacked up like dust in the corners of my home. I didn't talk about the Christmas I paid for or the doctor's appointment I took a taxi to alone. I didn't tell him about the ring they joked about or the way I had started locking my bedroom door. I didn't need to. He understood. Sometimes people think cutting someone out of a will is about punishment. But for me, it was about peace. It was about refusing to reward absence, to stop feeding the mouths that only open to take. It was about honoring myself, the version of me that had always given and never asked whether she had anything left. When the papers were printed, I signed them slowly. Each signature felt like a doorway closing behind me, a soft click of something final and freeing. At the end, he slid the documents into a blue folder and handed it to me. "Do you feel good about this?" he asked. I looked out the window. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the tile floor. People outside were going about their lives, unaware that something had shifted forever inside a quiet woman in a quiet office. "Yes," I said, "I do." As I gathered my things to leave, he stood and offered his hand. His palm was warm, steady. "You did something brave today," he said. "No," I replied softly. "I did something overdue." I walked to the car I had borrowed from a friend, not because I couldn't drive my own, but because I didn't want my children asking where I had gone. They had stopped asking questions that didn't benefit them. I would no longer offer them answers. Back home, I made tea and sat in my chair by the window. I watched the sky turn from orange to blue, to indigo, a slow surrender of color into night. I thought about the future, not with fear, but with relief. No more pretending, no more hoping for a change that never came. My legacy was no longer a gift for the ungrateful. It was a gesture for the unseen, the forgotten, the women like me, who once believed that to love meant to give until empty. Now I would give with intention, with purpose, to strangers who still knew how to say thank you, to people who might never meet me, but would feel the echo of my decision long after I was gone. And to my children, I left them what they gave me: silence. It was still dark when I began, the kind of dark that wraps around a house like a secret thick, hushed, not quite night, but nowhere near morning. I didn't turn on the main lights, just the small lamp in the hallway, the one with the yellow shade that cast everything in warm, forgiving tones. I moved slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but because I wanted to feel each moment. I wanted to know I was doing this with care, not spite. The suitcase was older than I remembered, scuffed at the edges, one wheel slightly bent from years ago when I'd dragged it too fast across an airport curb. I pulled it from the top of the closet, wiped the dust from its handle, and laid it open on the bed. Then I stood there for a moment, hands on my hips, staring at it like it might tell me what to take. In the end, I packed light. A few sweaters I loved, the soft cotton nightgown with the little lavender buds on the hem, 2 pairs of shoes, a scarf my mother had knit before her hands grew stiff. My photo albums, the ones with real pictures, not the digital ones they never looked at. I packed them with care, wrapping each spine in a clean towel, not because I thought anyone would damage them, but because I knew once I left, no one else would protect those memories. I didn't take the jewelry box. I didn't take the china they'd fought over in whispers. I didn't take anything I thought they might want. I took only what belonged to me, not by name or law, but by memory. Things I had loved quietly, things that had sat with me through sorrow and stillness. In the kitchen, I left behind a note. Not long, not bitter, just a few sentences written in a hand that was still, after all these years, steady. The house is yours now. Do with it what you will. I won't be returning. I've decided to spend what's left of my time in peace and in my own company. Do not contact me unless it's out of kindness, not convenience. You know the difference. I signed it simply Mother. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I moved from room to room like someone saying goodbye to an old friend. I touched the kitchen counter where I'd chopped vegetables for 100 meals they'd eaten without thanks. I ran my fingers across the doorknob they used to smudge with peanut butter and jam. I stepped into the living room where the couch still bore the indent of my body from all those nights I'd sat alone waiting for a call that never came. And when I opened the front door, the air hit my face like a whisper of something sacred, cold, clean, full of promise. The sky was just beginning to lighten, not sunrise, but the pale stretch of quiet before it. I pulled my coat tighter and wheeled the suitcase down the steps. I didn't look back. There's a myth that leaving always has to be loud, a slammed door, a shouted truth, a dramatic escape. But some exits are gentle. Some are soft enough not to wake the neighbors. Some are made in silence with nothing but the sound of a zipper closing and the rustle of paper left behind. I had made arrangements quietly, paid the rent on a small room in a retirement community 2 towns over, a modest place, clean, bright, private. No one knew but the manager, a kind woman named Evelyn, who had smiled when I asked if it was okay to bring my tea kettle. As I sat on the train, the sun finally rose. It painted the empty seats with gold. I watched the trees blur by, watched fields open and close like breathing lungs. I held my own hand on my lap. I felt no fear. I was not running. I was returning to myself. At the station, Evelyn met me with a cart. She helped me carry the suitcase, no questions asked. I admired that. No need for explanations. Just a woman choosing something different. Inside, my new room smelled faintly of lemons and freshly washed linen. There was a small balcony, a shelf for my books, a quiet view of a garden path. I unpacked slowly, folding each thing into its new place like a woman settling into her bones after a long walk. When the last drawer closed, I stood by the window and looked out at the roses below. Not quite blooming yet, but they would. Given time, given light. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window. My body ached in places I didn't know it could, but my chest felt light. My breathing unburdened. I didn't think of them. Not right away. I thought only of the silence, and how for once it wasn't loneliness. It was peace. I never imagined I would find joy in a place like this. Not after everything, not after all those years of believing that aging meant shrinking, meant dimming, meant being tucked away in a room and forgotten. But this place, this quiet corner of the world with its soft chairs and smell of warm bread, it felt less like an ending, and more like the breath I'd been holding in for decades, finally being exhaled. The first morning I woke without the sound of anyone's footsteps, pacing in my hallway without a knock at the door asking for something, a ride, a loan, a favor. No one needed anything from me. And I didn't need to explain my stillness. I opened my eyes and saw the pale curtains billow gently in the morning breeze, and I just lay there, letting the light reach me. There was a small calendar on the wall with optional activities painting Tai Chi poetry circles. I didn't sign up for anything the first week. I just wanted to feel myself again, to walk without being interrupted, to sit, without being asked to be a woman who could fill her own time with nothing but thought. The residents here weren't nosy. Some smiled in passing, some didn't. No one asked where I came from. No one asked why I didn't have visitors. And that, strangely, was the greatest gift. I wasn't pitied. I wasn't poked. I was just another name on a door. And I loved that. The staff called me Mrs. L at first. I didn't correct them. I liked the formality, the respect. After a few days, one of the nurses brought me chamomile tea without asking. "You looked like a tea person," she said. I smiled. It had been a long time since someone noticed something about me without expecting anything in return. I started reading again, not just magazines, but novels thick and lovely, the kind that stretch across generations and landscapes. I finished 3 in the first 2 weeks. I wrote small notes in the margins just to see my thoughts land somewhere. I underlined lines that made my heart skip and thought, yes, this is mine now. I bought myself new socks, silly, colorful ones, with stripes and tiny bees. No one saw them but me. That made them more special. I wore lipstick on Thursdays, even if I had nowhere to go, just because it made me feel like myself again, the version of me that used to dance barefoot in the kitchen when no one was watching. One afternoon, I found a chair tucked beneath a maple tree behind the building. It looked like no one had sat there in a while. I brushed it off and sat with my notebook, the one I had carried from the house. I began writing not lists, not bills, not plans for groceries or gifts. I wrote about my life, not the wounds, not yet. But the small, beautiful things I remembered before all of it became about survival. I wrote about the way my mother's hands smelled like flower and garden soil, the way my father used to whistle when he mowed the lawn, the sound of rain on the porch roof in the house I grew up in. I wrote, and as I wrote, I remembered I was a whole person before I ever became a mother, before I was ever asked to give more than I had. The staff brought a small dog in on Wednesdays, a therapy dog, fluffy and dopey and sweet. He waddled up to me once, laid his head on my foot, and I scratched behind his ear until he sighed in contentment. That little sigh, it nearly undid me, because it was the sound of simple trust, the kind that says, I'm safe here, I'm seen. That's what this place became for me. Not a waiting room before the end, but a space where I could exist quietly and entirely, where no one asked what I could offer, where no one measured my worth in meals cooked or dollars lent. I didn't talk much to the others, not at first. I wasn't lonely, but I was cautious. Then one morning, an older woman named Dottie sat beside me at breakfast and said, "You have kind eyes." That was it. That was all. But it opened a door. We talked, slowly, over days. We shared silence, too. Sometimes after lunch, we'd walk the path behind the building in companionable quiet. She never asked about my family, and I never asked about hers. We talked about Bird's Book soup recipes. One day she gave me a blue button she found on the sidewalk. "It looked like it belonged to you," she said. I sewed it into a pouch I made for my reading glasses. I wasn't building a new life exactly, more like uncovering the old one, the one I had tucked away when diapers needed changing, when bills needed paying, when silence was more manageable than conflict. Here I was slowly, softly returning to myself. And the most healing thing, no one was demanding an explanation for why I had left. Not here. No guilt-tripping voicemails. No lectures disguised as concern. Just space. Just air. Just time. And in that space, I began to believe something I hadn't dared to before. Maybe it's not too late to belong to myself. I didn't plan to write them. Not at first. I thought silence would be enough. I thought that leaving without ceremony, without a single slammed door or tearful goodbye, would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. But silence has its own weight, and after a few weeks in the retirement home, after the sunrises started to feel like gifts again, and the ache in my chest began to loosen, I realized there were things I needed to say. Not to be forgiven, not to fix anything, but to release what still lingered inside me. So I sat at the little desk by the window, the one that faced the garden path, where the squirrels darted between rose bushes, and I pulled out a stack of blank paper. I smoothed each page before writing. I didn't rush. Each letter took a day, sometimes two. I wrote them the way you write a memory, slowly, carefully, with honesty, and the kind of tenderness you save for old photographs and unsent prayers. I began with Sarah. I told her I remembered the way she used to braid her doll's hair beside me while I cooked, how she used to hum without knowing it, the same tune over and over. I told her I missed that sound, that soft hum. I told her I had watched her grow into a woman I barely recognized, sharp edges where there used to be softness, a hurried voice that didn't have time for mine. I told her I loved her, and that I had started protecting that love from being spent carelessly. I told her that love isn't unconditional when the conditions leave you empty. I told her I left because I realized that staying would only teach her how to take more. Then I wrote to Jeremy. I reminded him of the time he got sick in 3rd grade, and I sat by his bed all night, reading to him from the same book, until he fell asleep. I reminded him of the way he used to slip notes under my bedroom door that said, "Sorry," after arguments in crayon and crooked spelling. I told him I remembered every single one. I told him I had always been proud of his ambition, but that somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing people, including me, as anything but resources. That I wasn't a wallet, that I wasn't a fallback plan, that I had given him more than he would ever understand, and now I was giving myself back to myself. I told him I forgave him, but I no longer owed him access to me. And finally I wrote to Mia. Hers was the hardest, because hers held the most hope. I told her stories she was too young to remember, how she once gave me a wilted flower from the sidewalk and said, "This is for you because you're soft." How she fell asleep on my shoulder while watching cartoons, her small body trusting mine completely. I told her I saw something inside her that the world hadn't hardened yet, that she still had time to learn the difference between love that asks and love that gives. I told her I didn't blame her for growing up in a family that forgot how to nurture, but I hoped with everything in me that she would one day remember what I tried to show her, in the quiet moments, the way I looked at her, the meals I made, without being asked the way I always listened when she spoke. I told her I loved her more than anyone would ever know, and that if she ever wanted to find me, truly find me, I'd be somewhere full of sunlight and peace. But she'd have to come with open hands, not empty ones waiting to be filled. I sealed the letters, no dramatic wax stamps, no perfume, just simple envelopes with their names on the front. I mailed them from the little post office 2 blocks away. The woman behind the counter smiled and asked, "Sending anything important today?" And I said, only everything. Then I waited. For days, then weeks. Nothing. No call, no text, no reply. Sarah updated her social media. Jeremy shared a joke about boomer guilt. Mia posted a photo with friends under fairy lights captioned, "No drama, just peace." And that was when I understood the final lesson. Sometimes you can pour your whole soul into words, real ones, honest ones, stripped down and shaking, and still the people you send them to will fold those words into silence and tuck them somewhere they'll never look again. But writing those letters wasn't for them, not really. It was for me. It was the closing of a door with both hands, the turning of a page I had reread too many times, the soft, final sweep of the broom across the floor of an emptied room. Because I had said what needed saying, I had let them know they were seen, remembered, held to account, and still in some strange way loved. But not at the cost of myself anymore. Not anymore. It came on a Wednesday afternoon 3 years after I had left, the kind of afternoon where the sunlight spills lazily across the floor, and the birds outside seem half asleep, perched in the hush of early spring. I was shelling peas by the window, a small pleasure I'd returned to in recent months, something about the rhythm of it. The soft pop of pods releasing their quiet harvest felt like an old hymn I hadn't sung in years. The phone rang once, twice. I almost didn't answer. I rarely did these days. Most calls were automated or misdialed. But something about the timing, the pause between rings, made me reach for it. "Hello?" There was a delay, then a voice. A familiar one, rusted slightly with age and uncertainty. "Mom." "Jeremy." I said nothing, just held the phone a little tighter. I wasn't sure if this was still your number." "It is," I replied. Calm, measured, not cold, but not warm either. Like answering a knock from someone you once trusted to live in your house, but who now feels like a stranger standing in the yard. He cleared his throat. I didn't know where else to call. I didn't ask why he needed to. I already knew. There was a long pause, as if he hoped I might fill it with kindness, with invitation. I didn't. I waited. And eventually he spoke again. "I hate to even ask this, but we've hit a rough patch. Work's been hard. Expenses are piling up. Sarah and I were talking, and we were wondering if there's anything you could do. I mean, anything you could help with." I stared out the window. The garden was beginning to bloom again. Small, determined things, pushing up from the thawing soil. I thought about all the seasons that had passed since I'd last heard their voices, how many meals I'd eaten in peace, how many nights I'd fallen asleep without waiting for a call that never came. "Help how?" I asked gently. "Financially. Just to get through the next couple of months. It's not like... we know things were complicated, but we've been thinking about you. We were going to reach out sooner." I let his words hang. I could hear a baby crying faintly in the background, then someone shushing it. Life had moved on, it seemed. They'd had another child, a whole chapter I hadn't been told about. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't hurt. I just felt distance, miles, years, lifetimes of it, and I knew that no bridge would ever cross it again. I spoke slowly, clearly, as if threading each word with breath instead of wire. "Jeremy," I said, "I truly hope you find what you need, but I'm not a part of that world anymore." He didn't speak. I heard the air shift through the line. Maybe he was nodding. Maybe he was angry, or ashamed, or both. "I'm not angry," I added. "You need to know that. I just don't belong there. I've built something else now, something quiet, something whole. I can't give from a place I no longer live in." I understand he said, though I think he didn't. Not fully. I just thought, maybe shiny. I know I said. There was another silence. Then softly, okay, take care, Mom. I didn't say you too. I didn't say I love you. Not because those things weren't true in some small, exhausted part of me, but because those words belong to something sacred. And sacred things should be spoken only where they are honored. I placed the phone back on its cradle. My hand rested there for a while. Then I turned back to my peas. The bowl was nearly full. Bright green little half-moons of nourishment. I finished shelling the last pod and tossed the empty skins into the compost bin beside the sink. Waste, yes, but even waste can feed something if it's returned to the earth with intention. I made soup that night, just for me. Rosemary and garlic, a little lemon zest. And while it simmered, I sat by the window again, hands warm around a mug of tea, and listened to the wind carry the scent of something coming back to life. They had come back to ask for something, but I had already given everything I had to give. And now I was finally feeding myself. I don't mark anniversaries the way I used to, not birthdays, not holidays, not even the day I left that house behind. But sometimes when the air smells a certain way, rain just settling into warm earth, or the early green of spring, waking up in the trees, I remember. Not with pain, not with longing, just with the soft clarity of someone who has finally made peace with her own story. These days, I wake up when the light touches the curtain, not when a call or demand does. I make my tea slowly. Sometimes with honey, sometimes not. I listen to the birds outside my window, not always singing but always present. I read books without needing to report what I've learned to anyone. I walk when I feel like it. I rest when I don't. I say yes only when it feels light in my chest. And I say no with grace and without guilt. I kept waiting all those years for something to change, for them to see me, to thank me, to finally reach across the canyon between us with something real. But nothing came. Nothing except more requests, more assumptions, more silence wrapped in convenience. And then one day I realized I didn't need anything from them. Not love that came only when it was easy. Not apologies carved out of necessity. Not attention wrapped in manipulation. What I needed was space. What I needed was permission my own to choose myself, not just once, but every day. And so I gave it. Now the house I live in is smaller, quieter, but every corner belongs to me. Every photo on the wall is a moment I chose to keep. Every drawer, every cup, every curtain was picked, not for someone else's taste, but for mine. I do not wait for visits. I do not dread phone calls. The quiet here is not empty. It is full of my breath, my thoughts, my life. Sometimes I wonder what they tell people about me now. That I lost my mind, that I became bitter, that I disappeared. I used to worry about that, used to fear being misunderstood. But now I know peace doesn't require a defense. They will say what they want. I will keep living. Once not long ago, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was Mia's. Inside, just a short note. I think I understand now. I'm not ready yet, but I see it. I remember how soft your hands were. I hope you're happy. M. I folded it gently, placed it inside the back cover of my journal, and didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because some things don't need answers. Some things just need to sit quietly and bloom, if they will. I spent so many years watering a garden that never grew, and now without expectation, wildflowers spring up all around me. Not because I planted them for others, but because I made space for them in myself. My life is not grand, not loud, but it is mine. And that is the gift I kept. The house gone. The heirlooms given away. The money redirected with intention. But peace, that slow, steady beat inside my ribs, the one that says you did the right thing even if no one applauded, that is mine. That cannot be taken. That is what I wake up to now. Because I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And in the silence that followed, I found something I'd forgotten how to hold. Myself. Now the days pass like soft-spoken hours, quiet and warm, stitched together by routine and gentleness. I no longer measure time by who shows up or who remembers me or who doesn't. I measure it by the sound of wind in the trees outside my window, by the way light spills across the floor when the sun rises just right. I measure it by the calm that lives in my chest, steady as a heartbeat. I do not hate them. I do not even miss them, not in the way I used to. I understand now not everyone is meant to stay. Not every love survives neglect, and not every family remains whole when the scaffolding of sacrifice is removed. But I am whole. I am enough. There is a kind of healing that comes when you stop asking to be seen and start seeing yourself. A kind of quiet freedom in no longer chasing affection. No longer setting a place at the table for people who only show up when they're hungry. I sit by the window some evenings and let the sun fall across my hands. The same hands that once held, once fed, once comforted. They are older now, softer, but they are mine, and they still know how to make warmth. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. No inheritance, no apologies, no grand farewells. Just a woman in a room of her own finally remembering that her life, her time, her love, her name was never something to be borrowed, bartered, or ignored. It was always hers. And now at last she lives like she believes it.